In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And before the war, there is a pipe junction 600 meters below a hive's commercial district, and a man, elbow deep in a coolant leak, swearing at a valve that hasn't been replaced since before his grandmother was born. 8 seconds later, a clerk hands him a piece of parchment, and that life is over. Hey, I'm your brother from the void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is the whole thing, start to finish. Conscription to, well, you'll find out. This is Pol Grennig, pipefitter turned trooper, 47th Crucivane Rifles. A man who has been shot 3 times, stabbed twice, bitten once by something that shouldn't have had a mouth, and never once promoted. 11 years of the Imperial Guard, told by someone who started the journey staring at an open sky for the first time in his life and feeling physically sick because his brain couldn't process a ceiling that far away. This is what an entire life in the Guard actually looks like. Not the recruitment posters, not the sermons, the real thing. From the warehouse floor, where 1,000 new soldiers who aren't yet soldiers lie in the dark listening to someone pray, to wherever the Emperor's wars eventually spit you out, if they spit you out. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin.
They tell you the Emperor protects. I want you to know something about that right at the start, before I lose the thread of this. The Emperor protects. Sure. The way a furnace protects the metal inside it. You come out the other end changed into something useful, or you come out as slag, and nobody mourns slag. I have been a guardsman for 11 years, exposed to things that would make a preacher wet himself and call it holy tears. I have fought on 6 worlds, been shot 3 times, stabbed twice, bitten once by something that should not have had a mouth. And I have never, not once, been promoted. My name is Pol Grennig. I am a trooper in the 47th Crucivane Rifles, and every word of what follows is true. I know because I was there for all of it, and I have the scars to prove the parts that sound made up. Let me start where it started. Not in a trench, not on a battlefield, but in a pipe junction 600 meters below Hive Tursok's mid-level commercial district, on the world of Crucivane. That is where the Departmento Munitorum found me. Elbow deep in a coolant leak, swearing at a corroded valve that had not been replaced since before my grandmother was born. I was 22 standard Terran years old. I was a pipe fitter, 3rd class, employed by the Tursok Municipal Waterworks Authority, which is a very grand name for a department that employed 11 people and owned 1 functioning wrench between them. I spent my days crawling through maintenance shafts, breathing recycled air that tasted like someone else's lunch, and fixing things that should have been condemned decades ago. It was honest work. It was boring work. And I was reasonably good at it, which in a hive city means you get to keep doing it until your knees give out or a pipe bursts and takes you with it. My mother, Davara Grennig, worked the textile mills on level 416. My father I never knew. That was not unusual in Hive Tursok. Fathers were a luxury, like fresh fruit or windows that opened to actual air. You had a mother, you had a hab block number, and you had a work assignment, and that was the shape of your life. You woke up, you ate whatever the subsidized ration vendors were selling that cycle. You worked your shift, you came home, you slept in a room you shared with 3 or 4 other people, and then you did it all again. Day after day after day, until the day was different, and the different day was always worse than the ones before it. The draft notice came on a 7th day. I remember that because 7th day was my half shift, which meant I was home early, sitting on the edge of my cot with a tin cup of something the vendor had called recaf, but which tasted more like boiled floor sweepings. The notice was a single sheet of parchment delivered by an administratum clerk who looked like he had been having a worse day than me, which was saying something. He did not knock. He opened the door, looked at the room number, looked at me, said my name with a question mark at the end of it, and when I nodded, he handed me the parchment and left. The whole exchange took maybe 8 seconds. 8 seconds to end one life and start another. The notice said, in language so dense and formal it took me 3 readings to parse it, that by order of the planetary governor and the authority of the Departmento Munitorum, I, Pol Grennig, citizen designation Tersoc, mid 44227, had been selected for service in the Imperial Tithe Levy and was to report to Processing Center Orec 9 within 48 hours. Failure to report would result in summary arrest, penal service, and the forfeiture of all familial ration privileges. That last part was the real teeth of the thing. You could hide from a draft notice. You could not hide your mother from starvation. I went to my mother's hab that evening to tell her. I expected tears. I expected the kind of wailing grief that women in the lower hive performed when someone was taken, a ritual as old as the hive itself. What I got was silence. She looked at the parchment. She looked at me. She folded the parchment neatly in half and set it on the table and said, "You had better pack your things then." That was it. No tears, no wailing, no clutching at my sleeve. At the time, I thought she was being strong. I thought she was putting on a brave face. It was only later, much later, that I found out the truth, and the truth was worse than anything I encountered on any battlefield. But I am getting ahead of myself. We will come back to my mother. Processing Center. Orec 9 was a converted cargo warehouse on the hive's ground level near the freight gates. It was enormous, and it was full of people, thousands of them, all holding the same parchment, all wearing the same expression, which was the expression of someone who has just realized that the floor they were standing on has given way. There were families there, saying goodbye. There were loners like me standing in lines with nothing to hold but their notice. There were administratum clerks at long tables, checking names against ledgers, stamping documents, and feeding data into cogitator banks that hummed and clicked and spat out more parchment. The noise was incredible. Not loud in the way that a firefight is loud, but loud in the way that 1,000 frightened people trying to be brave all at the same time is loud. A murmur that builds into a wall of sound that presses against your skull. I stood in line for 6 hours. When I reached the table, a clerk looked at my notice, checked it against her ledger, stamped 3 separate forms, clipped a metal tag to a chain, and hung it around my neck, and pointed me toward a door at the far end of the warehouse. The metal tag had my name, my citizen designation, and a regiment number, 47CR 47th Crucivane Rifles. At the time, those words meant nothing to me. They were just letters and numbers on a piece of tin. I did not know that those letters and numbers would become my identity, my family, my entire world for the next 11 years. I did not know anything. I was a pipe fitter from mid-hive who knew how to fix a coolant valve and not much else. Through the door was a medicae station. They stripped us, checked our teeth, checked our eyes, checked parts of us that I did not know could be checked, pronounced us fit or unfit, and sent the fit ones through another door and the unfit ones back the way they came. I watched a man with a bad leg get turned away. He wept with relief. I have thought about that man many times since. He wept because he was going back to the hive, back to the pipes and the recycled air and the boiled floor sweepings. He thought he had been saved. I wonder sometimes if he ever realized that he was the lucky one. After the medicae station, they shaved our heads, all of us, men and women alike, down to the scalp. Then they gave us our kit, 1 pair of boots already worn by someone else, 1 set of fatigues, olive drab, standard issue. that fit me the way a sack fits a broom handle. One helmet, scratched and dented, the previous owner's name still scratched into the inside rim. I could read it if I tilted it right. Private Saron, K. I wondered what happened to Private Saron. I did not have to wonder very hard. Someone had worn this helmet and then stopped needing it, and now it was mine. Then they gave us our weapons. A las gun, Type 3 Mars pattern, stock scratched, power cell at half charge. The clerk who handed it to me said, "Do not lose this. It is worth more than you are." He was not being cruel. He was being accurate. We slept that night on the warehouse floor, 1,000 new soldiers who were not yet soldiers, lying on our backs in our ill-fitting fatigues, staring up at a ceiling we could not see in the dark. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? We were all thinking the same thing, and the thing we were thinking was too large and too terrifying to fit into words. Somewhere in that warehouse, in that darkness, someone started praying. A quiet, steady murmur. The litany of the Emperor's grace, which every child on Crucivane learns before they learn to read. One voice, then another, until the whole warehouse hummed with it. I did not pray. I lay there with my eyes open, listening, and I thought about coolant valves and corroded pipes, and the sound my wrench made when it slipped on a bolt that was rusted shut. And I held on to those thoughts like they were the last solid things in the universe. They loaded us onto transport haulers at dawn. Big, ugly, ground-level cargo vehicles with bench seating welded into the hold and no windows. We drove for hours through parts of the hive I had never seen, down through the lower levels where the air got thicker and warmer and the walls sweated with condensation, and then out through the freight gates into the open air. I had never been outside the hive before, not once in 22 years. The first thing I noticed was the sky. I had seen pictures of sky, of course. Everyone has. But pictures do not prepare you for the scale of it. It went on forever, in every direction, a ceiling so high and so distant that my brain could not process it as a real thing. I felt dizzy. I felt sick. Several people around me actually were sick. One man started crying, not from sadness, but from something more primal, a deep animal panic at being exposed, uncovered, uncontained. We were hive-born. We had lived our entire lives inside walls. The open sky was an assault. The transport took us to a landing field outside the hive. The field was flat and gray and enormous, and sitting on it was the largest thing I had ever seen. A bulk transport lander. A ship. Not a void ship, not yet, just the shuttle that would take us up to the void ship waiting in orbit. But it was vast enough to make the entire hive seem small. It squatted on the landing field like a metal cathedral, venting steam and heat, its loading ramps down like tongues. We filed up those ramps in a column, 4 abreast, and I remember looking up at the belly of that lander and thinking that it looked like the inside of a mouth, like we were being swallowed. We were. The flight up to the troop transport was rough. The lander shook and rattled and groaned in ways that made you absolutely certain it was about to come apart. People were sick. People were praying. A woman 2 rows ahead of me passed out entirely and had to be carried off when we docked. I gripped the restraint harness with both hands and stared straight ahead at the back of the seat in front of me, and I thought about pipes. Pipes are simple. Pipes make sense. Fluid goes in one end and comes out the other, and if it leaks, you fix the leak. I wanted the universe to be a pipe. It was not a pipe. It was chaos and noise, and the feeling of your stomach being pushed up into your throat as gravity let go of you for the first time in your life. The troop transport was called the Solemn Vigil. It was an old ship, massive, some naval class I never learned the name of, repurposed for carrying meat to wherever the meat was needed. It smelled the way all troop transports smell, which is to say it smelled of thousands of bodies living in a space designed for hundreds, layered with decades of imperfect cleaning and the chemical sting of disinfectant that was not strong enough to win the war. It was fighting. They packed us into the lower decks. Tiered bunks, 5 high, with about half a meter of clearance between your face and the bunk above you. You learn to sleep on your back. You learn to sleep in noise. You learn to sleep at all, which was an achievement, because the solemn vigil creaked and moaned constantly, the sound of an old hull under the stress of the void. And if you let yourself think about it, if you let yourself think about the fact that there was nothing between you and the infinite emptiness of space except a few centimeters of ancient metal, you would go mad. Some people did go mad. Not many, but some. They were taken away by the ship's armsmen, and we did not see them again, and nobody asked where they went. The journey took 9 weeks. 9 weeks in the belly of the solemn vigil, and it was during those 9 weeks that they turned us from hive workers and hab dwellers and ration queue standers into something resembling soldiers. The training was brutal. Not brutal in a creative way, not brutal with purpose or philosophy, just brutal in the way that grinding a stone against a wall is brutal. Repetitive, relentless, and designed to wear you down until what was left was either hard enough to be useful or dust. We drilled. We ran. We did push-ups in corridors that were not wide enough for push-ups. We learned to strip and reassemble our las guns while instructors screamed at us in voices that could peel paint. We learned to march in formation, which seems useless until you realize that marching in formation is not about marching. It is about doing what you are told when you are told, without thinking. That is what the Imperial Guard needs. Not heroes, not warriors. Obedient bodies that point their weapons in the right direction and pull the trigger when ordered. Our instructors were veterans of the Crucivane 31st, a regiment that had been chewed up so badly in some campaign nobody would name that they had been folded into training cadre rather than rebuilt. They were hard men with hard eyes, and they had no patience for anything that was not immediate, violent compliance. Sergeant Instructor Brannock was the worst. A short, wide man built like a clenched fist, with a voice like a grinding wheel and a creative vocabulary for describing our various inadequacies. He did not hit us. He did not have to. His voice was a weapon all on its own, and he wielded it with the precision of a master swordsman. He could reduce a grown man to trembling silence with a single sentence. He once told a recruit that the recruit's mother could have done the Imperium a greater service by swallowing, and the recruit just stood there and took it, because what else could you do? It was during training that I met the people who would become my squad, my family, such as it was. Let me tell you about them, because you cannot understand what came after without understanding who was there beside me. First, there was Sergeant Went Hafar. He was not our sergeant yet, not during training. He was just another recruit, same as the rest of us. But Hafar had something the rest of us did not. He had been in force, law enforcement in Hive Tursok's upper mid-levels, and he came in with the bearing and the calm of someone who had already spent years telling people what to do and making it stick. He was tall, lean, quiet. He did not shout. He did not need to. When Hafar told you to do something, you did it, because he asked in a way that made it clear he had already thought about it and decided it was the right call. The instructors noticed him almost immediately. He was squad leader within the first week and sergeant within the first month. Some people are born to lead. Hafar was one of them. I am not. I am born to fix pipes and follow instructions, and I have made my peace with that. Then there was Lura Preba. Emperor, preserve me, Preba. She was from the lower hive, level 290-something, A place so deep and so grim that mid-hivers like me thought of it the way most people think of fairy tales, as a place that probably existed, but that no reasonable person would want to visit. Preba talked, constantly, about everything, about nothing. She would talk while marching, talk while eating, talk while stripping her weapon, talk in her sleep. She had an opinion about everything and a filter for nothing. She was loud and abrasive, and she swore more creatively than any drill instructor I ever encountered. She was also, and I say this with complete sincerity, the best shot in the entire regiment. She could put a less bolt through a keyhole at 200 meters while carrying on a conversation about the quality of the rations. She was my best friend, not immediately. Nobody liked Preba immediately. Liking Preba was a process, like getting used to a rash. But once you got past the noise, once you realized that the talking was just how she processed a universe that terrified her, she was the most loyal, most reliable, most stubbornly alive person I have ever known. For a while, Osk Thunard was the opposite. If Preba was noise, Thunard was silence. A big man, wide across the shoulders, with hands like shovels and a face that looked like it had been assembled in a hurry from spare parts. He was from an agri-processing plant in the Hive's industrial quarter, where he had spent his pre-service years loading grain containers onto freight haulers. He could carry more than any two of us combined, and he could take a hit that would have flattened anyone else and just keep going, the way a boulder keeps going when you push it down a hill. He did not talk much. When he did, it was usually to say something so obvious that it circled back around to being profound. "It is raining," he once said during a downpour that was turning our trench into a river. "Yes, Thunard," Preba replied. "Thank you for the tactical assessment." He nodded seriously, as if she had genuinely thanked him, and went back to bailing water with his helmet. Then there was Nella Sorsh. Sorsh was mean. Not cruel, not sadistic, just mean, the same as a piece of industrial machinery is mean. Functional and unforgiving and completely indifferent to your feelings. She was from the enforcer families in the upper mid-levels, same tier as Hafar, but from a different precinct, and she carried herself with the rigid precision of someone who had been raised to believe that discipline was the highest virtue and comfort was a character flaw. She did not like me. She did not like Preba. She did not like anyone. But she did her job always, without fail, without complaint. And when the last bolts were flying and everything was going wrong, Sorsh was the one you wanted on your left, because Sorsh did not panic. Sorsh did not feel panic. I am not sure Sorsh felt anything at all, but whatever mechanism replaced emotion in her was extremely effective at keeping people alive. These were my people. These were the ones who mattered. There were others in the platoon, in the company, names and faces that came and went. But Hafar, Preba, Thunard, and Sorsh were the constants, the fixed points around which my entire war rotated. Remember their names. You will need them later. 9 weeks on the solemn vigil, and by the end of it we could march, shoot, dig, follow orders, and recite the litany from memory. We could strip and reassemble our weapons in under 30 seconds. We could put on our kit in the dark. We could sleep standing up, eat while moving, and keep our mouths shut when the Commissar walked past. Speaking of which, I should mention the Commissar. Every regiment gets one, the way every body gets a fever when it is sick. Ours was Commissar Draine. He was young, which was unusual. Most Commissars I have met since have been older, harder, worn down by years of watching men die and deciding which ones deserved to. Draine was fresh out of the Schola Progenium, all-pressed uniform and polished boots, and a bolt pistol so clean it looked like it had never been fired. He had a thin face and thin lips and eyes that watched everything and gave nothing back. He did not speak to us often. He did not need to. His presence was enough. You always knew where Draine was. You could feel him the way you can feel a cold spot in a room. He was a reminder. A walking, breathing reminder that the Imperium's mercy had limits, and that those limits were enforced with a bolt round. We made planetfall on our first war zone 6 days after exiting the warp. The solemn vigil dropped us in bulk landers, the same shaking, rattling, vomit-inducing experience as the flight up from Crucivane, but in reverse. Except this time, instead of going from a planet into the unknown, we were going from the unknown into something worse. We were going to war. The planet was called Pelwick's Stand, and I need to tell you about it. Pelwick's Stand was a frontier world on the edge of the Govaran Reach, a stretch of space that the cartographers described as lightly settled, and the soldiers who had been there described as the RC end of nothing. It was a flat, windswept world of gray scrubland and rocky hills, with a sky the color of old bruises. It had been colonized maybe 3 centuries ago by settlers who were either very brave or very desperate, or both. And they had built a string of small towns and farming settlements across the planet's temperate belt, connected by dirt roads and a single rattling rail line. It was not an important world. It did not produce anything of great value. It was not strategically significant. It was just there, a small dot on a big map, and the only reason anyone in the Departmento Munitorum cared about it was because the orcs had decided they wanted it. Orcs. If you have never fought orcs, let me save you some time. Forget everything you have heard. Forget the propaganda. Forget the training vids. Forget the little cartoons in the infantryman's uplifting primer that show orcs as stupid, disorganized brutes that a well-trained guardsman can handle with ease. The primer is a lie. The primer has always been a lie. It is a document written by people who have never been within 1,000 light years of an actual orc, designed to give you just enough confidence to walk into a situation that would otherwise make you turn around and run screaming in the other direction. Orcs are not stupid. They are not disorganized. They are, in fact, terrifyingly good at the one thing they exist to do, which is fight. They are bigger than you. They are stronger than you. They are tougher than you. They heal faster than you. And they enjoy it. That is the part that gets you. The enjoyment. You are fighting for your life, and they are having the time of theirs. We landed in a field outside a town called Brevnik, or what was left of a town called Brevnik. The orcs had rolled through it 2 weeks before we arrived, and done what orcs do, which is to say they had smashed everything that could be smashed and burned everything that could be burned, and then smashed and burned each other for a while out of sheer enthusiasm. The buildings were shells. The streets were cratered. There were bodies, but I will not describe them. I will say this. The training vids do not show you what an orc chopa does to a human body. The reality is both simpler and worse than anything you can imagine. A chopper does not cut cleanly. It breaks and tears. The results are not something you forget. Our regiment was part of a larger battle group, the 47th Crucivane Rifles, alongside the 109th Corvathi Dragoons, an armored regiment with Lehman Russ's tanks, and the 12th Pelwick Militia, which was what was left of the planet's own defense force. The Pelwick Militia were in bad shape. They had been fighting the orcs for months before we arrived, and they had the hollow look of people who had been screaming for help and had only just been heard. Our commanding officer was Colonel Varem, a woman with gray hair and a face like a clenched knot, who had been fighting orcs for most of her career and had the mechanical augmetic hand to prove it. She was competent, which I did not fully appreciate at the time because I did not yet understand how rare competence was in the Imperial Guard's officer corps. I would learn. Our orders were simple. Push the orcs out of the settled territories, retake the towns, hold the line until the orcs got bored or dead or both. This was the theory. The practice was different because the practice of war is always different from the theory of war, in the same way that the practice of falling off a roof is different from the theory of gravity. Both involve going down. Only one involves screaming. My first engagement was at a place called Hill 40. It was not really a hill, it was a low, rocky ridge overlooking a crossroads that somebody had decided was tactically important. The orcs were on one side, we were on the other. Between us was about 400 meters of open scrubland that might as well have been 400 kilometers for all the cover it offered. Our platoon was ordered to advance across that ground, take the ridge, and hold it until armor could move up in support. Lieutenant Grevin, our platoon commander, delivered the order with a calm that I later recognized as the calm of a man who knows he is sending people to die and has decided to be professional about it. We went over the top at dawn. I remember the exact moment because it was the exact moment I realized that everything before this, everything in my entire life up to this specific second, had been preparation for being very, very afraid. The fear was physical. It hit me like a wall. My legs did not want to move. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my lasgun. My mouth was dry and my heart was hammering, and every instinct I had, every animal impulse bred into me by millions of years of evolution was screaming at me to stop, turn around, get down, hide. I did not. Not because I was brave, not because I was disciplined, because Hafar was in front of me, walking forward with his weapon up, and Preba was beside me, and Thunard was behind me, and I was more afraid of failing them than I was of what was ahead. The orcs opened up when we were about 200 meters out. Big caliber slugs from crude but effective weapons that tore the air apart and kicked up fountains of dirt and rock where they hit. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, not the clean crack of a last gun, a deep percussive roar like the hive itself was falling on us. Men went down. The soldier to my left, a man whose name I never learned, took a round in the chest and stopped existing from the waist up. I did not stop. I could not stop. Stopping was dying. We ran. We fired. I do not know if I hit anything. I pointed my last gun in the direction of the muzzle flashes and pulled the trigger and ran and pulled the trigger and ran, and at some point, at some moment, that I cannot identify because time had stopped working the way it was supposed to, we were at the base of the ridge and the orcs were above us and they were coming down. The first orc I ever saw up close was about 3 meters tall and built like a piece of industrial equipment. Its skin was dark green, thick, leathery, covered in scars and crude tattoos. It carried a weapon that was part gun and part axe, and it was screaming, not in rage but in delight, a sound that came from deep in its barrel chest and rolled over us like a physical force. It was the most frightening thing I had ever seen. And it was only the first one. Behind it were more. Many more. A tide of green and metal and noise pouring down the ridge toward us. Hafar saved us. He was the first to react, the first to start giving orders when Lieutenant Grevin froze. "Concentrate fire! Left flank, concentrate fire!" And we did, because that was what we had been trained to do, to listen to the voice that sounded like it knew what was happening and do what it said. We poured last fire into the orcs, and they kept coming, and we kept firing, and they kept coming, and some of them fell, and the rest kept coming, and then they were on us, and the world became a very small, very violent place. Close combat with an orc is not something you survive through skill. You survive through luck, or through someone else's sacrifice, or through the simple mathematical reality that the orc you are facing chose to kill the person next to you instead of you. I survived because Thunard stepped between me and a charging orc and took the blow on his last gun, which shattered like glass, and then headbutted the orc in the jaw, which I did not think was physically possible, but which Thunard managed through sheer mass and stubbornness. The orc staggered. Sorsh shot it in the throat. I shot it in the face. It fell. Another one came. We shot that one too, and another, and another. And eventually, after what felt like hours but was probably minutes, the orcs pulled back, not defeated but just pausing, regrouping, the way a predator circles before lunging again. We took Hill 40. We held it for 3 days. The orcs came at us 4 more times, and each time we threw them back, and each time there were fewer of us to throw them back with. Lieutenant Grevin was killed on the 2nd day by a rocket that hit his position directly. He did not suffer. There was nothing left to suffer. Hafar took command of the platoon without being asked and without being authorized, and nobody questioned it, not even Commissar Draine, who watched with those cold, evaluating eyes and said nothing. On the night of the 2nd day, with Grevin still warm in the body bag and the orcs regrouping for another push, something happened that I did not understand until much later. A trooper in 3rd Squad, a boy named Fenwick, who could not have been older than 18, took a round in the gut during the 3rd assault. The medicae was overwhelmed. Fenwick was not going to make it, and everyone knew it except Fenwick, who was crying and calling for his mother and trying to hold his insides in with both hands. The rest of us were reloading, redistributing ammo, doing the things you do when you have 20 minutes before the next wave. Preba stopped what she was doing. She went to Fenwick and she sat down next to him in the mud, and she held his hand. She talked to him. Not about the wound, not about the Emperor, not about glory or duty or any of the things the priests say you are supposed to say to a dying man. She talked about food. She told him about a stall on level 290 that sold fried dough with sweetener, and how the old woman who ran it would give you an extra piece if you told her a joke, and how Preba once ate 9 pieces in a row and was sick behind the stall, and came back the next day for more. She talked until Fenwick stopped crying. She talked until his grip on her hand loosened, and his eyes went glassy and his breathing stopped. And then she talked for a little while longer, just in case he could still hear. And then she closed his eyes and stood up and went back to the firing line and did not say another word for 3 hours. That was the first time I ever saw Preba not talking. She had given all her words to a dying boy she barely knew, and there were none left. I remember something else from that night. I had gone to refill canteens from the water tank behind the command dugout, and I came around the corner and I saw Draine. He was sitting on an ammo crate, alone, in the dark, reading a letter by the light of a small lumen stick. Just reading. His bolt pistol was on the crate beside him, and his cap was off, and without the cap and the pistol and the coat and the cold stare, he looked young. He looked like what he was, which was a young man a long way from wherever he had come from, reading words that someone had written to him in a different life. He saw me. I expected anger, the outrage of a commissar caught in a private moment by a common trooper. Instead, he folded the letter carefully, put it in his breast pocket, and said, "Canteens." Not a question, a statement. I nodded. He nodded. That was all. But I never forgot it. I never forgot that Commissar Draine had someone who wrote him letters, and that he read them in the dark where nobody could see, and that he folded them carefully, the way you fold something precious. Preba got hit on the 3rd day, a slug that grazed her shoulder and tore a chunk of meat away, but left the bone intact. The medicae patched her up with synth skin and stims, and she was back on the line within an hour, firing with one arm and swearing with a fluency that impressed even the orcs. Or it would have, if orcs were capable of being impressed by anything other than violence. On the 4th day, the armor arrived. Lyman Russ battle tanks from the Corvathi Dragoons, grinding up the dirt road in a column of smoke and noise, their turrets traversing to find targets before they had even stopped moving. The lead tank crested the ridge and fired its main gun into the orc positions, and the sound of it, the deep, earth-shaking boom of a Lyman Russ battle cannon, was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The orcs broke. Not immediately, not all at once, but the tanks tipped the balance, and one by one, the greenskin mobs scattered into the scrubland, leaving their dead behind. We lost 37 soldiers taking and holding Hill 40, 37 out of a platoon of 52. Lieutenant Gavin, Corporal Druss. The campaign on Pelwick's stand lasted 4 months. 4 months of ridgelines and crossroads and towns with names I can barely remember, pushing the orcs back kilometer by painful kilometer across the gray scrubland. We learned things. We learned that orcs attack at dawn because they like the way the light looks. We learned that you should never ever chase a retreating orc because orcs do not retreat in the way humans retreat. They fall back to where they have hidden something larger and more explosive, and then they laugh when it goes off. We learned that the orcs' crude vehicles, their trucks and buggies and cobbled-together war machines, were unreliable and badly built, but fast and utterly terrifying when they came roaring out of the dust at 60 kilometers an hour, with an orc standing on the back firing a weapon the size of a small building. We also learned about each other. You learn more about a person in 4 months of combat than you learn in a lifetime of peace. I learned that Hafar snored. I learned that Preba was afraid of the dark, which she denied furiously, and which was obviously true. I learned that Thunard could not read, which nobody had noticed, because Thunard handled it with a quiet dignity that made you feel ashamed for ever having taken literacy for granted. Sorsh read him his orders every day without being asked, and if you mentioned it, she would look at you with an expression that strongly suggested you should stop mentioning it. And I learned about myself. I was a pipe fitter from mid-hive who was reasonably good at following orders and not dying. In the Imperial Guard, that is enough. Pelwick's stand was declared compliant after 4 months. The orcs were pushed back into the wastelands, where they would regroup and come back in a decade or two, because orcs always come back. But that was a problem for some future regiment, and some future set of poor souls with las guns and bad boots. We were done. The 47th Crucivane Rifles had lost over 400 soldiers, nearly half our strength, and we were rotated off-world for rest, refit, and reinforcement. We boarded the transports with the relieved exhaustion of people who have survived something they were not supposed to survive, and we left Pelwick's stand behind, and I never went back. I should tell you about what happened on the solemn vigil between Pelwick's stand and our next deployment. This is the part I have been avoiding. This is the part about my mother. We were 4 weeks into the transit. I was in my bunk, half asleep, when Preba came to find me. She had a strange look on her face. Not upset exactly. More the look of someone who has discovered something unpleasant and is not sure whether to share it. "Grennig," she said, "you need to come to the company office. There is a message for you." Messages from home were rare. The Munitorum mail system was a labyrinth of lost parcels and misdirected letters that made the hive's plumbing look efficient. But occasionally something got through, and this time something had. It was a letter, not from my mother, from a woman named Esavra Cullen, who identified herself as my mother's neighbor on level 416. The letter was short. It said that my mother had died 3 months after my departure. It said that the cause was a wasting sickness that had been progressing for some time. It said that my mother had known about the sickness before I was drafted. And then it said something else, something that I read 3 times because my brain refused to process it the first 2. My mother had volunteered my name for the tithe, not randomly selected, not pulled from a lottery. Volunteered. She had gone to the administratum office, filled out the forms, and put my name forward for the draft. She had done this because the tithe volunteers received a payment, a one-time stipend paid to the family of the volunteer, enough to cover medical treatment and ration supplements for approximately 6 months. My mother had sold my life to pay for 6 more months of her own. 6 months she had used, and which had not been enough, and which had ended with her dying in the same hab block where I had grown up, alone, in a bed that I was not there to sit beside. I read the letter, I folded it, I put it in my breast pocket. I went back to my bunk. Preba followed me. She sat on the edge of the bunk and said nothing. Preba, who always had words, who could fill any silence with noise the way water fills a crack, sat there and gave me the one thing she almost never gave anyone, which was quiet. I lay there and I stared at the bunk above me, and I thought about my mother standing in the administratum office, filling out the forms with her name and my name and the citizen designation numbers. And I thought about the clerk behind the desk stamping the documents and clipping the tag and the chain. And I thought about the expression on my mother's face when I came to tell her about the draft notice, the silence, the lack of tears, and I understood. She had not been brave. She had been guilty. She had known. She had known because she had done it. I want to tell you that I forgave her. I want to tell you that I understood, that I recognized the desperation of a dying woman with no options, that I saw the love in it, the twisted, broken logic of a mother who sold her son's life to buy herself a few more months of breathing. And maybe I do understand it in the part of my brain that deals in logic and reason and the cold mathematics of survival. But there is another part of me, the part that was a boy who loved his mother and thought she loved him back. And that part has never forgiven her. That part never will. I carried that letter in my breast pocket for the next 7 years, through 3 more campaigns, through blood and mud and horrors that made my mother's betrayal look like a minor inconvenience. I carried it until the pocket wore through and the letter fell apart and the words faded into illegibility. And even then I carried the scraps, because the scraps were all I had left of her. And because carrying them was a punishment I could inflict on myself that nobody else needed to know about. Preba knew. Preba always knew. She never brought it up again, and I loved her for it. But we are not done. We are not even close to done. There were more worlds to bleed on, and the next one was worse. The next one was always worse. We received our replacements while still in transit. Fresh bodies from Crucivane, shipped out on a different transport and transferred to the solemn vigil at a staging point I do not remember the name of. They were young. They looked the way we had looked 9 months ago, which was to say they looked terrified and determined and hopelessly unprepared. I watched them file into the barracks deck with their new boots and their half-charged lasguns and their helmets with other people's names scratched inside, and I felt old. I was 23. I had been a soldier for less than a year, and I felt old enough to be their grandfather. Among the replacements was a man named Darvek Gruel. I mention him specifically because Gruel matters to this story, though not in the way I expected at the time. Gruel was different from the other replacements. Older, for one, late 20s, which meant he had some life behind him before the draft. He was from the upper mid-levels of Hive Tursok, which was unusual because the upper mid rarely got drafted. They had the connections and the credits to make their names disappear from the tithe rolls. But Gruel had been drafted and he was here and he was friendly. Very friendly. He asked questions. He wanted to know about Pelwick's stand, about what the fighting had been like, about how the squad worked together, about Hafar's methods and Draine's habits, and the routine of the platoon. At the time, I took this for enthusiasm. A keen new trooper, eager to learn from the veterans. Preba liked him immediately. He laughed at her jokes and asked her about her shooting technique and listened, really listened, the way most people did not. Sorsh did not like him. When I asked her why, she said, "He asks too many questions about the wrong things." I thought she was being Sorsh. She was being right. Hafar had been officially promoted to sergeant after Pelwick's stand. It was not a reward. It was a recognition of reality. He had been doing the job since Gavin died. The paperwork just caught up. Our new platoon lieutenant was a man named Brelin Dorsk, who came from a noble family in Hive Tursok's upper spires, and who had been commissioned directly out of the Crucivane Officers' Academy without ever having been in a firefight. He was not a bad man. He was polite, well-spoken, and genuinely concerned about the welfare of his soldiers, which were qualities that would have made him an excellent administrator, and which made him a mediocre infantry officer. He deferred to Hafar on every tactical decision, which was smart, and he took credit for Hafar's tactical decisions in his reports to the captain, which was less smart but entirely predictable. Officers need victories on their records the way plants need light. It is how they grow. Our next deployment was a world called Grevin, Industrial World, a planet of manufactorums and processing plants and refineries, all connected by a sprawling network of rail lines and cargo roads, all feeding the Imperium's endless appetite for raw materials. Grevin produced chemicals, industrial solvents, fuel compounds, and about 300 other substances with long names and unpleasant properties. The atmosphere was thick with it. You could taste the air the moment you stepped off the lander. Not a taste you could identify, just a chemical sharpness at the back of your throat that said your lungs were processing something they were not designed to process. Welcome to Grevin. The situation on Grevin was different from Pelwick's stand. On Pelwick's stand, the enemy was external. Orcs came from outside, hit the planet, and we pushed them back. On Grevin, the enemy was already inside, a cult, not a street corner preacher with a bad pamphlet and a handful of malcontents. A real cult embedded deep in the worker population, spreading through the manufactorums like rust through a pipe. They called themselves the Reborn Crucible, and they had been active on Grevin for decades, growing quietly in the industrial underbelly of the planet, recruiting from the worker shifts, building hidden temples in abandoned processing plants, and waiting for a sign from whatever they worshipped in those temples. They got their sign. We never learned what form it took, whether it was a voice or a vision, or something that crawled out of the warp and whispered to them in the dark. All we knew was that when it came, they moved as one, and the planet tore itself apart. The planetary governor had called for aid when the cult went open. Overnight, or so the briefing said, the Reborn Crucible had thrown off secrecy and launched a coordinated uprising across 6 of Grevin's 9 major industrial zones. Workers turned on their overseers. Manufactorum militias were overwhelmed. PDF garrisons were overrun, in some cases from inside, by soldiers who had been cultists all along. By the time the 47th Crucivane Rifles made planetfall, the governor controlled only 3 zones, and those were under constant pressure. The rest of the planet was in the hands of the cult, and the things they were doing in the territories they controlled were the subject of rumors that nobody wanted to confirm. We were assigned to Zone 4, an industrial district centered on a massive chemical processing complex called the Grevin Central Refinery. The refinery was the size of a small city. Towers and stacks and pipe networks and storage tanks, all connected by walkways and gantries, all humming with the constant noise of industrial production. Or it had been humming. When we arrived, it was silent. The workers had abandoned it or been taken, and the refinery stood empty and dark, a labyrinth of metal and shadow. Our job was to secure it, clear it room by room, level by level, and make sure the cult had not turned it into a stronghold. Simple enough on paper. Paper, I was learning, was a terrible place to fight a war. The refinery was not empty. The cult was in there, and they had been busy. The first sign was the markings, symbols painted on the walls in something dark and thick that might have been paint and probably was not. The symbols meant nothing to me. They were angular, asymmetric, designed to hurt the eyes when you looked at them too long. The regimental priest, Father Henneth, took one look at the first symbol we found and made the sign of the Aquila and told us not to look at them. Do not look at them. Do not touch them. Do not think about them. Just paint over them and move on. We did. We painted over hundreds of them as we moved deeper into the refinery. I still see them sometimes in my dreams, the shapes writhing behind my eyelids in that specific dark that is not paint. The fighting in the refinery was close and ugly. The cultists had fortified key junctions and choke points, using the industrial machinery itself as cover and the pipe networks as concealed routes to move between positions. They knew the refinery better than we did. They had lived in it, worked in it, prayed in it. We were fighting on their ground, in their temple, and they had the zealot's advantage, which is the absolute certainty that dying for their cause was not just acceptable, but desirable. They came at us with a fervor that was difficult to process. These were not soldiers. They were factory workers with autoguns and improvised explosives, and a faith that burned in their eyes like fever. They charged our positions, screaming the name of something I will not repeat, and they kept charging even after they should have fallen, even after their bodies had taken damage that should have stopped them. Some of them kept fighting with wounds that were incompatible with life. I saw a man with half his torso missing, still trying to swing a pipe wrench. The stims the cult leaders had given their followers were military grade, maybe better. Or maybe it was not stims at all. Maybe it was something else, something worse. In the second week, something happened with Tyranid that I need to tell you about. We had pushed into a chemical processing wing, a maze of tanks and valves and control stations, and we hit a sealed bulkhead. The door had a manual override panel with printed instructions, step by step, for emergency opening. Hafer was 50 meters back, dealing with a cultist counterattack. Sorsh was on point, covering the corridor ahead. The bulkhead needed to be opened, and Tyranid was the one standing in front of it, and the instructions were printed on a metal plate in clear, standard Gothic. He stood there. I watched his eyes move across the text, left to right, the way someone who has watched other people read thinks reading works, and nothing happened. His face did not change. He did not panic. He simply stood there, staring at words that were as meaningless to him as the cultist symbols on the walls, and behind us the fighting was getting closer, and through that bulkhead was the only route forward. I came up beside him. I read the instructions. I entered the override sequence. The bulkhead opened. Tyranid looked at me and I looked at him, and he said, "Thank you," in the same voice he used when someone passed him the salt. We went through. We never talked about it. But here is the thing I did not expect. 2 days later, we breached a cult shrine, a room deep in the refinery that the reborn Crucible had been using for their rituals. The walls were covered in writing, not the angular symbols we had been painting over, but words, actual words in a corrupted form of Gothic, prayers and incantations and promises written in that same dark substance that was not paint. Father Henneth screamed at us not to read them. Most of us could not help it. Your eyes find words the way water finds a crack, and once the words are in, they do their work. 3 soldiers in another platoon had to be restrained after reading the shrine walls. They were raving, clawing at their own faces, repeating phrases they should not have known. Tyranid walked through that room untouched. He looked at the walls the way he looked at everything he could not read, with mild disinterest. The words slid off him like rain off a hull plate. The weapon the cult had built into those walls, the trap of language and meaning that had been designed to burrow into a literate mind and crack it open, found nothing to grip in Thunard. He walked through the shrine room and out the other side and waited for us on the far end, and when Preba asked him if he was all right, he said, "The room smelled bad," and that was all. We cleared the refinery in 3 weeks. 3 weeks of room by room, corridor by corridor fighting in a chemical-soaked metal maze. We lost people, not as many as Pelwick's stand, but the losses hurt differently, because on Pelwick's stand we lost people to an enemy we could see and understand. The orcs were monstrous, but they were honest. They wanted to fight, and they fought, and when they killed you, it was impersonal, a storm that does not know your name. The cultists were human. They had names and families and work histories. Some of them, when the stims wore off and the fervor faded, begged for mercy. Some of them called out for people, mothers, children, partners. They died with human words on their lips, and that was harder. That was much harder. Lieutenant Dosk did not handle Grevin well. He was not built for this kind of war. He flinched at sounds. He hesitated at doorways. He gave orders and then changed them back. Hafar covered for him as much as he could, gently redirecting, quietly supplementing, filling the gaps that Dosk's uncertainty left open. But there was a limit to how much covering could be done, and that limit was reached in the 3rd week in a section of the refinery that the cartographic team had designated Block Aurex 7. Block Aurex 7 was a chemical storage facility. Massive tanks, each one the size of a hab block, connected by overhead pipes and accessed by narrow walkways. Our intelligence said it was lightly held. Our intelligence was wrong. The cult had packed Block Aurex 7 with fighters, hundreds of them, hidden in and around and between the tanks. And when our platoon moved in, they sprung the trap. Fire from every direction. Above, below, both sides. We were caught in a kill box. Dosk froze. Not panicked, not ran, just froze. Stood there with his pistol in his hand and his mouth open and his eyes wide and did nothing while people died around him. Hafar grabbed him by the collar, physically pulled him behind a tank, and took command. Hafar always took command. We fought our way out. It took 4 hours. When it was over, 11 of our platoon were dead, and Dosk was sitting behind the same tank where Hafar had put him, staring at his hands. Commissar Draine appeared, as he always appeared, materializing out of the smoke and the noise, as if he had been there all along. He looked at Dosk. He looked at Hafar. He looked at the bodies. He said nothing. He walked away. 3 hours later, Dosk was transferred to a logistics position in the rear echelon. He was simply removed, without a shot fired and without formal punishment, the way you remove a part that is not functioning. I never saw him again. I heard later that he requested a transfer to the Munitorum's supply division, where he reportedly excelled. Some people are meant for war. Some people are meant for paperwork. There is no shame in either. Only in pretending to be one when you are the other. And then there was Gruel. The ambush at Block Aurex 7 had been too precise. Hafar said so. The intelligence had said the area was lightly held, and someone had believed that intelligence, and someone had routed us through the kill box, and the whole thing had the feel of a trap that had been designed for us specifically, not for a generic platoon, but for our platoon, on our route, at our time. Hafar said this to me quietly, in the aftermath, and I saw his jaw tighten, the way it tightened when he was working through something he did not want to arrive at. Gruel disappeared on the 3rd night after the ambush. Not killed, not captured. Gone. His bunk was empty, his kit was there, his las gun was there, but Gruel was not. The provost found him 4 days later in a section of the refinery we had already cleared, sitting in a room with a Vox set that was not standard issue, transmitting on a frequency that matched the cult's internal communications. He was not a cultist, not exactly. He was something worse. He was an informant. The cult had gotten to him before the draft, or during transit, or at some point that nobody could identify, because the process of corruption does not announce itself. It works quietly, through favors and whispers, and the slow erosion of things you thought were solid. Gruel had been feeding the cult information about our movements, our routes, our schedules. The ambush at Aurex 7 was his work. 11 people had died because Gruel had told the cult exactly where we would be and when. Draine handled it. That was the Commissar's job, after all. I did not watch. I heard the bolt pistol, a single sharp crack that echoed through the refinery corridors and then was gone. Preba, who had liked Gruel, who had laughed with him and taught him her shooting stance and shared rations with him, sat on the floor of the corridor with her back against the wall and stared at the far wall and said nothing for a very long time. When she finally spoke, she said, "I keep trying to figure out which part of him was real, the part that laughed at my jokes or the part that got people killed." I told her it might have been both. She looked at me as if I had said something deeply unfair and deeply true at the same time. I think about Gruel more than I should, not because I miss him, not because I mourn him, but because he made me understand something I had not wanted to understand. That you can like someone and trust someone and sit beside them in a trench and share the same fear and the same bad food. And the whole time they can be something else entirely, something wearing a human face because human faces are useful and you will never know until the damage is done. Hafar was given a field commission to lieutenant. He did not want it. He told me so, sitting on an ammo crate in the back of a supply chimera, eating a ration bar that tasted like compressed sawdust. "I was a good sergeant," he said. "Now I have to be a good officer, and those are different things." He was right. They were different things. But Hafar managed to be good at both because Hafar was one of those rare people who was good at whatever the situation demanded, and what the situation on Grevin demanded was someone who could lead from the front and think from the back, and do both at the same time. After the refinery, we were rotated to the southern industrial zone, where the cult had seized a worker settlement called Genevar. This was different from the refinery. This was a town with streets and buildings and civilians, or what we were told were civilians. The briefing said that the cult had taken the town by force and that the workers were being held as hostages and human shields. Our orders were to liberate the town, neutralize the cult presence, and minimize civilian casualties. These orders came from people who had never fought in a town full of cultists and who did not understand that minimize civilian casualties is a phrase that sounds clean in a briefing room and sounds obscene in a street where you cannot tell the civilians from the cultists because the cultists look like civilians and the civilians are too afraid to run. We entered Genevar at dawn. The first street was quiet. The second street was quiet. The third street was an ambush, but we expected that and dealt with it. By the fourth street, the civilians started coming out. They came out of the buildings with their hands up, stumbling toward us, crying, calling out for help. We directed them to the rear, to the processing points where the Munitorum teams would check them, identify them, sort them. It was going well. It felt like a liberation. It felt like we were doing something good, something that justified the boots and the las guns and the scratched helmets and the whole bloody enterprise. It stopped feeling like that on the 6th Street. I do not know who gave the signal. I do not know if there was a signal or if it was spontaneous, or if it was something else entirely. something triggered by the symbols on the walls or the words the cult leaders had buried in their followers' minds. What I know is that one moment the civilians were walking toward us with their hands up, and the next moment they were pulling weapons from under their clothing and opening fire. Not all of them, maybe a third, maybe less. But when a crowd of 60 people suddenly includes 20 shooters, and you cannot tell which 20, everything stops being simple. Everything becomes a choice between dying and killing someone who might be innocent. We returned fire. We had to. They were killing us. But every shot we fired went into a crowd that included children and grandmothers and workers who were genuinely unarmed and genuinely terrified, and who were dying because they happened to be standing next to someone who was trying to kill us. Preba stopped shooting. I saw her lower her weapon and stand there, just stand there in the middle of the street with lass bolts cracking past her head, and I grabbed her arm and pulled her into cover, and she looked at me and her face was wet, and she said, "Grennig, they're people." And I said, "I know." And we both went back to shooting because we had to, because the alternative was dying, and dying did not help anyone. The action on the 6th Street lasted 11 minutes. I know because Sorsh timed it. Sorsh timed everything. When it was over, the street was full of bodies, cultists and civilians mixed together, impossible to separate, impossible to sort into the neat categories that the briefing had promised. The cultists had planned it this way. They had known we would come. They had known we would try to be careful, try to be humane, and they had used that against us. They had wrapped themselves in the civilian population like armor, knowing that every shot we fired would cost us something that bullets could not replace. I do not know what to call that. I know what the priests call it. They call it the corruption of chaos, the way the dark gods twist everything they touch until even mercy becomes a weapon. I do not know about dark gods. I know that I killed people on that street who might have been innocent, and that I will carry that for however long I have left, and that however long I have left will not be long enough to set it down. Grevin broke something in us, all of us. Even Thanard, who processed the world in simple, direct terms, started staring into middle distances during meal breaks, seeing something that was not there. Preba talked more than ever, but the talking had changed. It was faster, more brittle, like she was building a wall of words between herself and whatever was behind her eyes. Hafar held us together because that was what Hafar did, but I could see the strain in him, the effort it took to be the steady point when the ground was always moving. And Sorsh, who did not feel things, who was a machine in human skin, who had fired into that crowd on the 6th Street with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything. I want to tell you about the night after Genevar. We were billeted in a cleared manufactorum, sleeping on the floor between rows of silent machinery. I could not sleep. The faces from the 6th Street were behind my eyelids every time I closed them, so I kept them open. Sometime past the middle of the night, I heard a sound. Quiet, controlled, almost inaudible beneath the hum of the building's dormant generators. It was Sorsh. She was in the far corner behind a machine press, and she was crying. Not the way most people cry, with noise and shaking and the loss of composure. She was crying the way she did everything else. Precisely, efficiently, with absolute control, as if she was rationing even her grief, allocating it a specific number of minutes before putting it away. I listened for a while. I did not go to her. Going to her would have been an insult, because Sorsh had chosen to cry where no one could see, and to violate that choice would have been to violate the last piece of her that the war had not touched. In the morning she was Sorsh again. Hard, sharp, immaculate. She cleaned her weapon, she ate her rations, she checked the firing pins on the squad's last guns because nobody had asked her to, and because it needed doing. She did not look at me. I did not look at her. We never spoke about it. That was the kindest thing I have ever done for another person, and it cost me nothing but the willingness to pretend I had not heard. Grevin was declared compliant after 2 months. Compliant, that was the word. As if a world that had been torn apart from inside, where the dead numbered in the hundreds of thousands and the survivors would never trust their neighbors again, could be made compliant by a stamp on a document and a regimental flag raised over a ruined refinery. We left Grevin the way we left Pelwick's stand, packed into transports, staring at walls, not talking about the things we had seen. The letter in my breast pocket was joined by new ghosts. The faces on the 6th Street, the sound of someone calling for their mother while I reloaded, the weight of choices that had no right answer. The solemn vigil carried us into the void. We were given 3 months for rest and refit. New replacements arrived, new faces, new names, new boots. We trained them the way we had been trained, grinding them down until what was left was either hard enough or dust. We told them about Pelwick's stand. We did not tell them about Grevin. Some things are not useful to know in advance. Some things you can only learn by living through them, and the learning breaks you, and the breaking is the lesson. Father Henneth did not make it off Grevin intact. Not physically, his body was fine, but whatever keeps a man's mind pointed in the right direction had come loose somewhere in those refinery corridors. It started with the refusal to leave his quarters. Then came the drawings. He drew the aquila on the walls of his cabin, over and over, but each time a little wrong, the wings bending in directions that wings should not bend, until the thing on his wall looked nothing like an aquila at all, and the medicae team sedated him and took him away. His replacement was Father Vorek, a younger man, louder, considerably more enthusiastic about the Emperor's divine wrath. His sermons were long and emphatic and full of references to fire and purification that I found uncomfortable after Grevin, where fire and purification had been used by both sides and neither had come out looking particularly divine. But the sermons served their purpose. They gave the regiment a rhythm. They gave the new replacements something to believe in. Preba attended every one. When I asked her about it, she shrugged and said, "The benches are comfortable, and it is warm in the chapel, and I can sleep with my eyes open." During the rest period, Hafar pulled me aside one evening. We were in the lower mess, drinking what the galley optimistically called ale, which tasted like it had been filtered through a sock, and then the sock had been wrung out and served separately. Hafar looked at me over the rim of his cup and said, "Grennig, I want you to know something. If anything happens to me, I need you to keep the squad together." I told him that was Sorsh's job. He shook his head. "Sorsh keeps them alive. You keep them human. There is a difference." I did not understand what he meant. I thought about it for a long time afterward, and I think I understand it now. But understanding came too late to matter. 3 months passed. Orders came. Our next deployment. But it was not Morven Tertia. Not yet. Before the worst thing, there was the easy thing, and the easy thing was worse in its own way because it made us believe that the universe could be kind. The world was called Esavar, a border world on the edge of Tau-claimed space, a rocky temperate planet with breathable air and actual weather, and a sky that was blue, genuinely blue, the kind of blue that you see in the propaganda murals on the hive walls and assume is a lie. It was not a lie. Esavar's sky was blue, and its air was clean, and its gravity was close enough to standard that your knees did not ache. After Pelwick's stand and Grevin, Esavar felt like a dream. It felt like the universe had made a mistake and put us somewhere pleasant by accident. The mission was straightforward. A Tau expeditionary force, small, a few hundred fire warriors and their support drones, had established a presence in a series of settlements on Esavar's northern continent. The local population had not resisted. Some of them had cooperated. The Departmento Munitorum classified this as a Xenos incursion and an uprising simultaneously, which was efficient in a way that only the Munitorum could manage. Our job was to push the Tau out and restore Imperial compliance. No chaos, no orcs, no hive-eating horrors, just clean combat against a conventional enemy on a planet with good sight lines and solid ground. We landed expecting a fight. What we got was more like a negotiation conducted with las fire. The Tau were good. Their weapons were precise, their tactics were disciplined, and their drones were irritating in a way that I had not previously considered a military problem. But they were few, and we were many, and they were far from their supply lines, and we had armor, and they did not. The engagements were sharp but short. We would advance, the Tau would contest, there would be an exchange of fire that lasted an hour or two, and then the Tau would withdraw in good order to the next position, leaving behind nothing useful. It was almost civilized. After the refinery on Grevin, after the 6th Street in Genevar, fighting the Tau felt like switching from gut-rot moonshine to clean water. It still went down, but it did not burn. We took the northern continent in 6 weeks. Casualties were light. Nobody in the core squad was hit. Preba complained that the Tau did not get close enough for her to properly insult them, which she considered a failure of enemy etiquette. Thunard found the climate agreeable and spent his off hours sitting outside the bivouac, face turned up to the sun, with an expression of deep and genuine contentment. Sorsh maintained that it was a trick. "It is too easy," she said. "They are pulling us in. This is bait." It was not bait. It was just an easy deployment, the kind that happens once in a career if you are lucky, and we were lucky, and the luck made us soft, and the softness made what came next hit harder. I had time to think on Esavar. That was the dangerous part. On Pelwick's stand and Grevin, there had been no time to think, and not thinking was a kindness. On Esavar, in the quiet evenings under that blue sky, with the clean air moving through the bivouac and the distant sound of Tau weapons fire already fading into the past tense, the thinking came back. I thought about Gruel. I thought about the 6th Street. I thought about my mother. I thought about the letter in my breast pocket, and whether the words, already fading, were fading fast enough. The thinking was not useful. It was not productive. It was just the mind doing what the mind does when you stop feeding it, emergencies, which is to turn inward and find the things you buried, and dig them up, and lay them out for inspection. I did not enjoy Esavar as much as I should have. I was too busy being haunted to appreciate the sunshine. Esavar was declared compliant. We redeployed to the solemn vigil, drew fresh supplies, and waited for orders. The orders came fast. The name of the world was Morven Tertia, and the briefing said the word I had been dreading since the first day I put on the uniform. Tyranids. The room went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when someone says a word that means death, and everyone in the room knows it. Let me tell you what the infantryman's uplifting primer says about Tyranids. It says they are Xenos organisms of limited intelligence, driven by instinct, vulnerable to concentrated las fire, and prone to disorganization when their larger synapse creatures are eliminated. The primer recommends engaging Tyranids at range, targeting the largest organisms first, and maintaining unit cohesion. The primer then provides a helpful illustration of a smiling guardsman standing over the corpse of a small Tyranid creature, giving a thumbs up. I have mentioned before that the primer is a lie. In the case of the Tyranid entry, it is not merely a lie. It is an act of cruelty so profound that I believe the person who wrote it should be tried for murder by deception. Tyranids are not organisms of limited intelligence. They are a single intelligence, a vast, incomprehensible hunger that spans the void between stars, and every creature in a Tyranid swarm is a finger on a hand that belongs to something so large that the word large loses all meaning. They do not think the way we think. They do not plan the way we plan. But they adapt. Emperor, help me, they adapt. You find a tactic that works and you use it and it works again. And then it stops working because they have changed, because the swarm has observed and processed and adjusted, and now the thing that killed them yesterday feeds them today. They learn faster than you do, and there are more of them than there are of you, and they do not stop. They do not stop, they do not get tired. They do not get afraid. They do not care about losses, because every organism that dies becomes raw material for the next one. You are not fighting an army. You are fighting an ocean, and the ocean is hungry, and you are standing on the shore with a cup trying to hold it back. Morven Tertia was an agri-world. Had been an agri-world, not the green paradise that the propaganda murals depict. Even before the Tyranids, Morven Tertia had been a harsh place. Its soil stripped of native life and force-fed with industrial fertilizers, its air thick with chemical dust from the processing plants, its workers bound to the harvest cycles with the same iron grip the hive bound us to our shifts. By the time we arrived, it was becoming something else entirely. The Tyranids had hit it 6 weeks before the first Guard regiments made planetfall, and in those 6 weeks they had done what Tyranids do, which is consume. The planet's atmosphere was already changing, thickening. The sky had a greenish hue that was not clouds and not pollution, but something biological, spores, some kind of organic particulate that the Tyranids seeded in advance of their ground forces. We wore rebreathers from the moment we stepped off the lander. The air tasted of metal and something sweet, a cloying sweetness that got into your throat and sat there. I did not like that sweetness. Nothing about Tyranids should be sweet. The ground was wrong, too. Morven Tertia had been a world of vast grain fields, kilometer after kilometer of engineered crop monoculture that fed a dozen systems. The fields were still there, but they were dying. The grain was brown and withered, and between the rows of dead crops, something else was growing. Fleshy, pale, glistening, tendrils and nodules and things that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic contraction like a heartbeat. The Tyranids were not just invading the planet. They were digesting it, converting its biomass into fuel for the swarm. The ground itself was being eaten, and walking on it felt wrong in a way I could not articulate, like the earth was alive under your boots and was aware of your weight. We were part of a massive defensive operation, 12 regiments, plus armor, plus PDF remnants, all dug in around the planet's primary starport at a city called Kalan's Reach. The idea was simple, or at least it was presented as simple. Hold the starport, maintain the evacuation corridor, get as many civilians off-world as possible before the Tyranid swarm reached critical mass. Reinforcements were coming. That is what the briefing said. Reinforcements were coming. The Navy was assembling a battle group. Additional regiments were being diverted. We just had to hold. Just hold. The word just was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. We dug in. Trenches, bunkers, fire positions, overlapping fields of fire. We strung razor wire and planted mines and set up heavy weapons emplacements and did everything that the Tactica Imperialis said you should do when preparing a defensive position, and then we sat in our trenches and we waited. Waiting is the worst part. Not the fighting. The waiting. Because when you are fighting, you are too busy to think. When you are waiting, the thinking is all you have, and the thoughts are not gentle. You think about the things you have seen. You think about the things you are about to see. You think about home, which for me was a place that no longer felt like home, a hive on a distant world where my mother had sold my name to buy herself 6 months of dying. Preba handled the waiting by talking. Of course she did. She sat in the trench beside me, her last gun across her knees, and she talked about food. Not the ration bars and nutrient paste we were eating, but real food, the kind that existed in the hive's upper levels, the kind that neither of us had ever actually eaten. "When we get out of this," she said, "I am going to find a place that serves real meat, not the reclaimed stuff, real meat from an actual animal. And I am going to eat so much of it that they have to carry me out." I told her that she had never eaten real meat in her life and would not know what to do with it. She told me that the doing what to do with it was the eating part, and that she was confident in her ability to eat. Thunard, sitting on her other side, said, "I have eaten meat." We both looked at him. "At the plant," he said, "a grox escaped from the processing line. It ran into the loading bay. Someone shot it. We cooked it on a heat exchanger." He paused. It was good. This was, by Thunard's standards, a lengthy and emotional speech, and Preba honored it with a moment of silence before launching into a detailed analysis of the various ways one could theoretically prepare grox, none of which she had any experience with, and all of which sounded increasingly improbable. Sorsh cleaned her weapon and said nothing. Sorsh always cleaned her weapon. I think if you cut Sorsh open, you would find a smaller Sorsh inside, also cleaning her weapon. The Tyranids came on the 4th day. They came at night, which was wrong, because the briefing said Tyranids typically attacked during peak temperature hours when their cold-blooded metabolisms were most efficient. The briefing was wrong. The briefing was based on data from previous Tyranid incursions, and the problem with basing your tactics on previous Tyranid data is that the Tyranids have also read your previous data in their way, and they have adjusted. They came at night in the rain, and the first we knew of it was not the sound of them or the sight of them, but the smell. A thick, wet, organic stench that rolled over the trenches like fog. The smell of a billion organisms moving across dead farmland, converting everything they touched into fuel. That smell is in my nightmares. It will be in my nightmares until I stop having nightmares, which, based on current projections, will be when I stop having a brain to have them in. Then the sound, not a roar, not a scream, a chittering. Millions of mandibles and claws, clicking and scraping and tapping, a sound that built and built until it was not a sound anymore, but a vibration, a physical pressure against your eardrums and your chest and your skull. You felt it in your teeth, you felt it in your bones, and then the flares went up and the night turned white, and we saw them. I have fought orcs. Orcs are terrifying because they are big and strong, and they enjoy killing you. I have fought cultists. Cultists are terrifying because they are human, and they have chosen to be something worse. Tyranids are terrifying because they are neither. They are not big and strong, or rather, some of them are. But that is not the point. The point is the numbers. The point is looking out over a field that was empty 30 seconds ago and seeing it now carpeted, edge to edge, horizon to horizon, with moving bodies. Creatures the size of dogs, the size of men, the size of tanks, all flowing forward in a tide that had no beginning and no end, driven by a hunger that was not emotional but mechanical, the way a machine is hungry for fuel. They were not angry at us. They were not afraid of us. We were not enemies. We were food. The order came to fire, and we fired. Every weapon on the line opened up at once. Las guns, heavy bolters, autocannons, las cannons, the deep thunder of the Lehman Russ battle cannons behind our lines. The night lit up. The front rank of the swarm dissolved. Creatures burst and fell, and the ones behind them ran over the bodies and kept coming. We fired, and they came. We fired, and they came. The minefields detonated, throwing chunks of alien flesh into the air, and they came. The razor wire snagged them, and they piled up against it until the wire snapped under the sheer weight, and they came. They reached the trenches, and they poured in like water. The fighting in the trenches was not like anything I can describe in words that make sense. It was noise and teeth and claws and the hot spray of alien ichor and the screams of men and women being pulled apart by things that did not care that they were screaming. I fired my las gun until the power cell was empty, and then I picked up another las gun and fired that one, and then I used the empty one as a club, because the creature in front of me was too close to shoot. Thunard fought with his bare hands at one point, grabbing a small creature by what might have been its head and smashing it against the trench wall until it stopped moving. Sorsh was a machine. She fired, reloaded with a rhythm and a precision that was inhuman in its consistency. Preba screamed obscenities that would have made a preacher faint, and shot things that should not have been possible to shoot in the dark, in the rain, in the chaos. They pulled back, not because we won, because the synapse creature controlling that wave was killed by a Lascanin shot from somewhere on our right flank, and without its guidance, the smaller organisms lost cohesion and scattered. We had maybe 20 minutes before the swarm reorganized. 20 minutes to reload, redistribute ammo, drag the wounded to the medicae stations, and stack the dead in places where they would not obstruct our firing lines. 20 minutes to breathe, and the breathing was hard because the air was full of spores and ichor and the smell of things that should not exist. The second wave came, and the third, and the fourth. Each one larger than the last, each one adapted slightly differently, as if the swarm was testing us, probing for weaknesses, filing away information for the next assault. By the third wave, they had learned to approach from the flanks, where our heavy weapons coverage was thinner. By the fourth, they were using larger organisms as living shields, advancing behind walls of chitin and muscle that absorbed our fire, while the smaller creatures swarmed around the edges. It was learning. In real time, in front of our eyes, it was learning how to kill us more efficiently. We held. For 3 days, we held. 3 days of wave after wave, with brief, exhausted pauses between that were never long enough to sleep and barely long enough to eat. 3 days during which the defensive perimeter shrank, trench by trench, position by position, as we gave ground we could not hold and consolidated into positions we could. 3 days during which the sky grew greener and the air grew thicker and the ground beneath our feet grew softer, wetter, warmer, as if the planet itself was being digested out from under us. On the second day, reinforcements were promised, a message from Fleet Command relayed through the regiment's Vox network. A battle group was en route, 3 days out. Hold for 3 more days. We could do 3 more days. We had already done 2. What was one more? 1 more day of Tyranids, 1 more day of claws and teeth, and the wet sound of mandibles on flak armor and bone. 1 more day. On the 3rd day, the message was updated. The battle group had encountered Tyranid void organisms. Engagement was ongoing. Revised arrival. 5 days. Hold for 5 more days. 5 more days. The mathematics of 5 more days were not good. We were running low on ammunition. We were running low on power cells. We were running low on our people. The defensive perimeter had contracted to less than half its original size, and the trenches we still held were full of dead that we did not have time to move, and wounded that we did not have the medicae supplies to treat. On the fourth day, the message was updated again. The battle group had been forced to disengage. Tyranid void presence too heavy. Revised arrival unknown. Hold. Hold. Hold for how long? Hold with what? Hold against what? The message did not say. The message said hold, and so we held, because that was what the Imperial Guard did. The Imperial Guard held. We held lines that could not be held on worlds that could not be saved, against enemies that could not be beaten, because holding was what we were for. We were the wall. We were the fingers in the dam. We were the bodies in the breach. And when the wall fell, when the dam broke, when the breach swallowed us, the Imperium would raise another wall out of more bodies and more laguns and more helmets with dead men's names scratched inside. Hafar gathered what was left of the platoon, 21 soldiers out of the 50 we had started with. He looked at us, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something behind his eyes that might have been despair. It was there for a moment, a flicker, and then it was gone, replaced by the steady, measured calm that was Hafar's gift and Hafar's curse. "We hold until we cannot hold any more," he said, "and when we cannot hold any more, we make them pay for every meter." Nobody argued. Nobody asked about the reinforcements. We all knew. The reinforcements were not coming. They were never coming. We were alone on a dying world, and the only question left was how long we could make the dying last. The answer, as it turned out, was 8 more days. 8 days that I will now tell you about, because someone should know, and because the dead cannot speak for themselves, and because the Munitorum's after-action reports will reduce those 8 days to numbers and coordinates and tactical summaries that strip out everything that mattered. The reports will not mention that Thunard sang. On the 5th night, sitting in the trench with his back against the wall and alien blood drying on his fatigues, Thunard sang. A low, tuneless song from the agri-processing plants, a work song that the loaders sang to keep time as they stacked containers. It had no words, or the words had been worn away by repetition until they were just sounds rising and falling in a rhythm that matched the rhythm of heavy lifting. Preba joined in, adding her own melody on top. Something from the lower hive that I did not recognize, but that fit somehow, 2 broken pieces of a thing pressing together even if they came from different things. Sorsh did not sing. I did not sing. But we listened, and the listening was enough. The reports will not mention that Commissar Draine died saving a medicae tent. On the 6th day, a Tyranid organism, something large and fast that the veterans called a ravener, burst through the ground inside our perimeter, right in the middle of the field hospital. It came up through the earth like a nightmare being born, all claws and teeth and segmented body, and it began killing the wounded. Draine was there. He was always there, appearing where he was needed with the silent inevitability of a natural law. I saw what happened next from 30 meters away through the chaos in fragments between the press of bodies. He emptied his pistol into the creature's thorax. The bolts punched through chitin and detonated inside, and the thing screamed, a sound like tearing metal, and turned on him. Draine drew his chainsword. It was the first time I had ever seen him draw it. The blade roared to life, and he went at the creature with a ferocity that I did not know was in him, hacking at its limbs, its body, its head, driving it back from the wounded, buying time for the medicae staff to evacuate the tent. The creature took his left arm off at the elbow. He kept fighting. It took his legs out from under him with a sweep of its tail. He kept fighting, on the ground, on his back, sawing at the thing's neck with his chainsword while it tore into him. By the time I fought my way to him, both he and the creature were dead. tangled together in the mud, and the expression on Draine's face was not pain or fear, but something that looked very much like satisfaction. I had spent months being afraid of Commissar Draine. I spent 1 minute watching him die, and in that 1 minute I understood him better than in all the months before. He was not cruel. He was not cold. He was a man who believed in something so completely that the believing had burned away everything else, and when the moment came to prove that belief, he proved it. I have met very few people I would call brave. Draine was one of them. The reports will not mention the children. On the 7th day, a group of refugees reached our lines. Civilians from the outlying settlements who had been walking for days, surviving on whatever they could find, dodging Tyranid organisms in the dead fields. There were 43 of them. 11 were children. The youngest was maybe 4 years old, a girl with hollow eyes and a stuffed cloth toy that she held against her chest with both hands. We brought them inside the perimeter. We gave them food. We gave the children water from our own canteens, which meant less water for us, and nobody complained. Because there are limits to what war can take from you, and the willingness to give water to a thirsty child is past that limit. The girl with the toy sat in the trench next to Thunard and fell asleep leaning against his arm, and Thunard sat perfectly still for 4 hours, rather than disturb her. I watched him sitting there, this huge, silent man with shovel hands and a face like assembled spare parts, not moving, barely breathing, letting a child sleep against him in the middle of a Tyranid siege, and I thought, this is it. This is what we are fighting for, not the Imperium, not the Emperor, not the flags and the litanies and the grand pronouncements. This, a tired child sleeping safely because a good man chose to sit still. The 8th day was the day everything ended. The swarm launched its largest assault at dawn. Not the creeping, probing attacks of the previous days, a full commitment. The horizon moved. I am not using a metaphor. The horizon physically moved because the distance between us and the edge of the Tyranid swarm had closed to nothing. And what we were looking at was not landscape anymore, but organisms. An ocean of chitin and claw and fang moving toward us with the unstoppable inevitability of a tide. And like a tide, it would not be stopped by anything we could do. It could only be endured. We fired. Everything fired. Every weapon, every emplacement, every tank, every man and woman with a las gun and a clear line of sight. The swarm hit the wire and rolled over it. It hit the minefields and rolled through them. It hit the first trench line, and the soldiers in that trench fought until they were overwhelmed, and then the swarm rolled on, toward the second line, toward us. The noise was beyond description. Not loud. Loud does not cover it. It was total. It filled every space, every gap, every silence, until there was nothing else. Just the noise and the swarm and the firing and the dying. They reached our trench. And here is where I lose the clean narrative, because what happened in the next hour was not a story. It was a series of moments disconnected, out of order, stamped into my memory like boot prints in mud. Thunard, standing in the trench with a broken heavy bolter that he was using as a club, swinging it in wide arcs that cleared the space around him like a man cutting grain. His face was calm, not brave calm, just calm, as if this was the loading bay again, and the containers needed stacking and the work needed doing. Sorsh firing from the hip, walking backwards, methodical, precise, placing each shot exactly where it needed to go, even as the tide of creatures pressed closer and the space between her muzzle and their bodies shrank to arm's length. She did not flinch. She did not hurry. She did not waste a single shot. I said that Sorsh did not feel things. I was wrong. Sorsh felt everything. She just did not let it change the angle of her weapon. Hafar on the Vox, calling for fire support that was not coming, requesting extraction that was not possible, his voice steady, professional, calm, even as the world came apart around him. "This is Crucivane 47, 2nd Platoon. We are being overrun, requesting immediate fire support on coordinates following." A pause. Static. Nothing. "Crucivane 47, 2nd Platoon. Does anyone copy?" Static. Nothing. He put the Vox down. He picked up his last gun. He looked at me, and there was nothing in his eyes that I did not recognize. We had been doing this together for a long time. We did not need words. And Preba. I need to tell you about Preba. Preba was beside me. She was always beside me. She was firing, talking, swearing, being Preba with every fiber of her being. And the swarm was pressing in, and the trench was filling with bodies, ours and theirs. And the footing was getting worse, and the angles were getting tighter, and there were too many of them, and not enough of us. Preba grabbed my arm and pulled me to the left, into a connecting trench, away from the main wave. And we ran, ducking under grasping limbs and snapping mandibles, firing behind us without looking, just moving, just surviving. We reached a communication trench that led toward the rear positions. It was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and the walls were high, and the sky above was full of spores and winged things, and the greenish haze that was not sky anymore. Preba went first. I followed. We were maybe 50 meters into the trench when the ground erupted behind us. Another burrowing creature coming up through the earth, blocking our retreat. We kept moving forward. There was nothing behind us now. Only forward. The trench opened into a small bunker, a dugout that had been used as a supply cache. It was empty. The supplies had been distributed or destroyed. It was just a hole in the ground with reinforced walls and a heavy flakboard roof, and a doorway that led out to the next trench section. Preba went through the doorway first, and she stopped, and she said, "Oh." I came up behind her, and I looked over her shoulder, and I saw what she saw. The next trench section was gone. Not overrun. Gone. The ground had been churned up by something enormous, one of the larger Tyranid organisms, a creature so big that its passage had obliterated the trench entirely, leaving behind a raw, wet furrow of upturned earth and broken duckboards and things I did not want to identify. Beyond the furrow was open ground, and beyond the open ground was the swarm, and between us and anywhere that might have been safe was a distance that could not be crossed on foot by anyone who wanted to remain alive. "Well," Preba said. She looked at me. She smiled. It was the smile of someone who has just heard a very good joke and is waiting for you to get it. "I think this is it, Grennig." I told her it was not. I told her we would find another way. I told her things that I did not believe because I needed to say them and she needed to hear them, even though we both knew they were not true. She shook her head. "Listen to me. For once in your life, shut up and listen to Preba." She was still smiling. "I need you to stay in the bunker. The walls are thick. They might miss you. I'm going to go out there and make some noise and draw them away from you, because I am very good at making noise, as you have pointed out many times." I grabbed her arm. I told her no. I told her that was not a plan, that was suicide. She looked down at my hand on her arm, and then she looked at me, and the smile was still there, but her eyes were different. Her eyes were the eyes of a person who has already made the decision and is just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. "Grennig," she said, "you are the worst pipe fitter in the Imperium, but you are the best friend I have ever had. Stay in the bunker. That is not a request." She pulled her arm free. She checked her last gun. Half a power cell. She looked at the doorway, at the darkness beyond it, and I remembered that Preba was afraid of the dark. She had always been afraid of the dark. She patted me on the chest once, the way you pat a wall to make sure it is solid, and then she turned and walked out of the bunker into the dark, and I heard her start shooting, and I heard her start yelling, the loudest, filthiest string of profanity I had ever heard. A masterwork of vulgarity that reached crescendos of creative obscenity I did not think were possible in low Gothic. And I heard the swarm respond, the chittering, the clicking, the sound of 1,000 organisms adjusting their trajectory toward the source of the noise. I stayed in the bunker. I want you to know that. I stayed in the bunker the way she told me to, and I listened to Preba. I listened to her voice get further away, and then closer again, and then further, and the shooting got more sporadic, and the swearing got quieter. And then there was a sound that was not a word, and not a scream, but something in between. And then there was nothing. And I stayed in the bunker with my back against the wall and my knees pulled up to my chest, and I held the last gun across my lap. And I did not move, and I did not make a sound, and the swarm flowed past outside, and something scratched at the flakboard roof, and something sniffed at the doorway and then moved on, and I stayed there in the dark for what might have been hours or might have been days. They found me, not the Tyranids, the rescue, because it turned out the reinforcements did come after all. Not on the 5th day and not on the 8th day, but on the 9th, when it was too late for most of us, and almost too late for all of us. A Navy battle group broke through the Tyranid void screen and launched a massive orbital bombardment that cracked the swarm's coherence. And then the dropships came, carrying fresh regiments and heavy armor, and they pushed the Tyranids back from Kellen's reach, and they found the survivors. There were not many survivors. Hafar was alive. He had rallied a group of 30 soldiers from 3 different platoons and held a section of the inner perimeter for 16 hours. He was promoted again to captain, and he did not want it, and he took it because that was what Hafar did. Thunard was alive. He had carried 2 wounded soldiers, one under each arm, through 300 meters of contested ground to a medicae station that was itself under attack, and then he had stayed and defended the station until the relief arrived. The girl with the cloth toy was among the survivors. She was alive because Thunard had put her inside a supply crate with air holes punched in the lid and told her to stay quiet. And she had stayed quiet and she had lived. Sorsh was alive. She had been hit twice, once in the leg and once in the side, and she had kept fighting until she passed out from blood loss. And when she woke up in the medicae tent, she asked for her weapon before she asked for water. Preba was dead. Preba was dead, and the Munitorum report listed her as killed in action. Morven, Tertia. Day 8, cause of death. Enemy action, and that was all. Those were all the words that Lura Preba, who had more words in her than anyone I have ever known, who talked while marching and talked while eating and talked in her sleep, who could put a lass bolt through a keyhole at 200 meters while carrying on a conversation, who was loud and abrasive and afraid of the dark and the best friend I ever had or ever will have. Those were all the words she got. Killed in action. Enemy action. File closed. I took the scraps of my mother's letter out of my breast pocket. They were illegible, worn to nothing. I buried them in the mud of Morven Tertia, in the trench where Preba had told me to stay in the bunker, and I left them there. I did not need them anymore. I had new things to carry, or so I thought. Because 3 months after Morven Tertia, while the 47th was in transit to Emperor knows where, another letter found me. The Munitorum mail system is a joke, but like all jokes, it occasionally delivers a punchline. And this punchline had been in transit for years, bouncing from sorting depot to sorting depot, chasing me across the galaxy with the mindless persistence of a bureaucratic system that does not know when to stop. It was from Esavra Cullen again, the same neighbor. But this letter was different. It had been written later, maybe a year after the first, and the tone was different. Hesitant, apologetic. She wrote that she had been thinking about what she had told me, about my mother volunteering my name. She wrote that she wanted to add something. She had spoken to the clerk at the Administratum office, the same clerk who had processed my mother's forms, and the clerk had told her something. Tithe volunteers from Hive Tursock were processed differently from lottery conscripts. They were assigned to regiments with established reputations, regiments with lower than average casualty rates, regiments with experienced officers and functional supply chains. The 47th Crucivane Rifles was one of these regiments. The lottery conscripts, the ones pulled at random, were assigned to whatever needed bodies. Penal legions, siege regiments, the kind of units that existed to absorb casualties so that other units did not have to. Esavra wrote that she did not know if my mother had known this. She wrote that she was not sure it mattered. She wrote that she had spent a long time trying to decide whether to send the letter at all because she did not know if the information would make things better or worse. I read the letter. I sat with it for a long time. I turned it over in my mind, this new piece of a puzzle I thought I had already completed. My mother, dying, walking into the Administratum office, putting my name on the volunteer list. Had she known? Had some clerk told her the way Esavra's clerk had told Esavra? Had she chosen the 47th specifically, deliberately, steering me toward a regiment where the odds were slightly less terrible? Had her betrayal been a different kind of thing? Not the selfish act of a desperate woman buying time, but the calculated gamble of a mother who knew she was going to die and who wanted her son to have the best chance she could give him, even if the giving looked like selling. I do not know. I will never know. She is dead, and the dead do not explain themselves. The truth is somewhere in the gap between the two letters, and the gap is wide enough to hold every version of her. The mother who sold me, and the mother who saved me, and the mother who did both at the same time, because the universe she lived in did not offer a choice that was cleanly one or the other. I did not bury this letter. I folded it and I put it in my breast pocket in the place where the first letter had been. And it is there now. That was 3 years ago. 3 years, 2 more campaigns, 100 more trench lines, and 1,000 more nights of staring at the dark and listening for sounds that were not there. Hafar made major. Thunard is still a trooper, same as me. Sorsh made corporal and hated every second of it. We got new people. We lost new people. The 47th Crucivane Rifles kept fighting because that is what the 47th Crucivane Rifles does. The new recruits call me Old Grennig, which is generous considering I am 33, which on most worlds is not old and on most battlefields is ancient. They ask me for advice. They ask me how to survive. There is no advice. The secret is that there is no secret. The best soldier in the platoon dies just as easily as the worst one when the shell lands on his position, and you, the pipe fitter from mid-hive, who does nothing special and has no particular talent for war, you can walk through 11 years of combat without a scratch that matters. There is no reason for it. No plan. No design. Just luck. Dumb, blind, stupid luck, and the moment you start thinking you have earned it, the universe corrects you. I am 33 years old. I have been a soldier for 11 years. I have seen 6 worlds and fought more enemies than I care to name and buried more friends than I can count without it hurting. I am a trooper. I have never been promoted. I will never be promoted, and I do not want to be promoted. I am a pipe fitter from Hive Tursock who was sold into the Guard by his own mother, or saved by her, or both. And I have made my peace with not knowing which. There is a boy sitting in the trench next to me. He arrived yesterday with the latest batch of replacements. He is young. He has new boots and a half-charged las gun, and a helmet with someone else's name scratched inside the rim. He has been staring at the horizon for the past hour with the expression of someone who has just realized that the floor they were standing on has given way. He reminds me of someone. He reminds me of me. He turns to me. He looks at me with those wide, frightened eyes, and he asks the question they all ask, the question that every new trooper has asked, every old trooper since the first regiment was raised on the first world that sent its children to die for the Imperium. Is it going to be all right? I look at him, and everything comes at once. Preba walking out of the bunker with half a power cell and a mouthful of profanity. Draine reading his letter in the dark, folding it carefully, the way you fold something precious. Thunard sitting still for 4 hours, so a child could sleep. Sorsh crying behind a machine press where nobody could see. My mother standing in the administratum office with my name on a form and a choice that was not a choice. The whole ugly, beautiful, unbearable weight of 11 years of being alive when so many others are not. I put my hand on his shoulder. The Emperor protects, I tell him. It is the only answer I have.